the Radical Film and Lecture Series, of which I'm a part, which is a group of graduate students at NYU, based in the Sociology department. Also sponsored by New Politics, a magazine which you can purchase at the front. Initially we were selling apparently for $7, but there's actually a special price, so it's deflated in price in the last 30 minutes. So if you paid $7, you can come and get a refund. And then also it's co-sponsored by the Campaign for Peace and Democracy, and Joanne can tell you more about the campaign. We're very, very lucky to have 4 excellent speakers with us. I'm going to introduce them in a second, but there's just a couple of items of business to go through before. One of those is that the event will be filmed. So if anyone has any qualms about being on film, you can talk to Beth, who's right here, either after the event or while you're speaking or anything like that. The other thing is that we want to go out for dinner after or hang out afterwards, but we're having trouble finding a location. So if anybody has any ideas, you can let me know and we can call in advance. And the event will end at 9. Hopefully we'll find some place around here to chat afterwards. And then the last thing is just there are a few future events to keep in mind. So the Radical Film and Lecture Series, I'm going to pass around a piece of paper. You can sign up. We usually host fairly regular film screenings on campus. So we'll be showing, we have been showing Eyes on the Prize, which is, I'm sure, as many of you know, a wonderful documentary about the civil rights movement. We're going to show also a movie about the anti-apartheid struggle, a series of movies about the anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa. And then we have this event coming up that's co-sponsored also by the campaign, which has a member of Syriza coming to speak about the situation in Greece. And that'll be at the end of October, I think, also at NYU. So you can get a flyer, it's the yellow one. So let me just introduce the speakers, and then I'm going to hand it over to my moderator in arms, Joanne.
Let me just say, I thought we could consolidate the sign-up. Perfect. I have a sheet here saying you'll get notices from all 3 groups, New Politics, Campaign for Peace and Democracy, and RFLS. If there's something you don't want to hear from, you can indicate that. We won't take it personally. Perfect. So will you pass those around? Okay, excellent. Okay, so we have 4, as I said, 4 wonderful speakers. The first speaker is Nadina, who is an activist for social justice and in particular for disability rights. She's been arrested countless times for civil disobedience and is an organizer for American Disabled for Attendant Programs Today, ADAPT, Not Dead Yet, and the Disability Caucus of Occupy Wall Street. We also have Paula Wolff, who is president of Disabled in Action and active in Occupy Wall Street as well. She's participated in the disability rights movement for more than 35 years. She's a social worker and direct services supervisor at the Center for Independence of the Disabled in New York. And then we have 2 speakers who have flown from Canada to be with us here today. We have Ravi, who's a disability rights advocate, a sponsor of New Politics, and an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa in Canada. He's published widely on disability rights and serves on the Human Rights Committee of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. And you can find Ravi has a piece, along with Jihan, in the issue of New Politics, which I mentioned. And then we have Jihan, who's the 4th speaker. Jihan's a Vanier Canada Graduate Scholar and PhD candidate at Carleton University in Ottawa. Her research interests include disability in the labor market, social policy, and inclusion. I think each of the speakers will speak for about 15 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. So, Joanne? Well, okay. I'm not going to stay over there. Can everybody hear me? A little louder, okay. You asked for it. Our first speaker is Ravi Malhotra, and I'm going to try and really enforce the time limits on all the people because I want there to be a chance for people in the audience to not only ask questions but make comments and so forth. So if you see me opening trap doors or using a cane on any of the 4 speakers, it's in the broader general interest. Okay, Ravi?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me here, and I will try to keep my remarks as brief as possible. It's a great honor to be able to speak on a panel with Nadina LaSpina and to have such a distinguished audience, and including Jeff Perry, the author of biography of Hubert Harrison. So I'm very honored to be able to speak to such a distinguished audience and speak on such a great panel. Going to be brief as possible. So I'm going to speak on some of the impacts of neoliberalism on people with disabilities. At the core of the ideas that we're articulating here is the idea of the social model. For those of you that are new to disability theory, the social model is the idea that it is structural barriers that are the primary problem faced by disabled people, people with disabilities. And I use both terms interchangeably, and you can ask me question period why that is so. So it's embodied in both vibrant but largely ignored social movements from below, such as the militants in ADAPT, who fought for accessible public transportation, and more recently for effective attendance services, and in a more complicated manner, it's articulated in legislation you have in the United States and in many other countries, like the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so you have a powerful overview of the social movements that embody the disability rights movement. And I say movements because it's not one movement. It's a coalition, I would argue, of separate movements that work together. It's a disparate collection of overlapping groups. You can take a look at a panoply of texts. There's a litany of disability studies. They pile up my office because they keep publishing so many of them. But one I highly recommend, I have the pleasure that the surviving author is in the audience, is Doris Zane Fleischer's Disability Rights Movement that she co-wrote with her late sister, Frida Zames, and one of my heroes. And there's a street named after Frida in the city of Manhattan, as many of you will know. So and you can get that book from Temple University Press. Social model contrasts with the medical model. The medical model focuses primarily on transforming physiological impairment. Social model focuses on social barriers. And so you can see the potential for doing politics, politics of social justice, politics from below, that I would argue fit in with the social justice agenda through the social model. And if you read the special section that we have here, and I've raised it before, on New Politics, it's accessible online as well, but you can also purchase a copy. You'll see contributions from myself, from Jihan, who's going to be speaking later, my fellow Canadian to my right, and also from two very interesting individuals who aren't here today, Anne Finger, who many of you will know, past president of the Society for Disability Studies and a prominent intellectual who was recently on WBAI with me, speaking about her piece on Antonio Gramsci, and Chris J. Ford of New Zealand, who's speaking about neoliberalism. So in the limited time that I have, I'm going to be largely overlapping with what Chris Ford would say if he were able to be here. He's in New Zealand, not able to speak, but you can read his work, and I'm talking about neoliberalism and disability. So what is neoliberalism? So just another word, just jargon. There's a rich literature on it. In my mind, it has to do with the reduction of the use of welfare, the expansion of workfare, and also to do with the transformation of the nature of work. So you no longer have the 9-to-5 Fortis job, you've got a lovely post-Fortis job, which may be 5 hours a week or 15 hours a week, which means a person has to fit in 3 or 4 jobs to make ends meet. Or it could mean the other kind of post-Fortis job, which for those of you who are in law may be familiar with those many industries, not just law, which is 100 hours a week or 120 hours a week. And then if you're someone who requires accommodations, the post-Fortis job that's excessive may also not be to your liking. Although I would argue, I think that's true for anyone, whether you're disabled or not. I think that those jobs on either end of the spectrum are troubling. So they involve overtime work without pay, and often this would occur without benefit. So in this model, there's been a drastic paradigm shift to the notion that a person outside the labor market should accept any job regardless of working conditions. And am I being polemical when I'm saying that? I'm actually quoting ministers or what you call cabinet secretaries in Canada. Those are statements they've made on television telling unemployed people to accept any job. So that's not a polemical Marxian statement. That's just quoting public officials. And I'm sure the same is true. I could quote a litany of Republicans and Democrats that have made analogous statements in the United States. I mean, which pioneered many of the initiatives that work for, now is being copied by many countries. So this marks a sharp departure from the Keynesian welfare state consensus, which for what the French call le 30 années glorieuses, 30 glorious years after the end of the Second World War, you had a period across the West, including the United States, of full employment, the wide spread availability of full-time well-paid jobs and strong unions. The latter one, well, not so much in the United States, but I mean, by and large, those conditions held across the Western world for 30 years. The last period, which really extends across my lifetime, since the early 70s, has been a period of non-stop cuts and the destruction of the welfare state. So if you read my comrade Chris Ford's piece, you'll see there's been an increase in disability harassment as the welfare state is slashed in Britain and other countries, and disabled people are increasingly being blamed as malingerers. So in his piece, he eloquently describes the story of when Peter Greener, a man living in the town of Hebron who has multiple sclerosis, who is subject of abuse by a neighbor who thinks he doesn't have a disability. This man has multiple sclerosis, definitely a disability, but for some reason, this man decides his neighbor is a malingerer, and so he's calling the hotline and is harassing him. And so across Europe, as the economic crisis deepens, these sorts of traumatic incidents are going to become more common. This does not, however, mark the disappearance of the state as in some Randian fantasy. The state is very much with us, but the role of the state is being transformed. There's a re-regulation of what the state does, away from economic redistribution to organizing markets for the maximization of profits. At least that's what I would argue. I would argue that the state has not vanished, as some people would suggest, but simply been re-regulated. So how did we get here to this point, 2012? As Colin Barnes and Deborah Stone have both argued, with industrialization and urbanization, one saw the conflation of work with paid employment. In feudal times, you didn't necessarily have this sort of division, and people with disabilities or disabled people were able to make that contribution because you did not have the notion of wage labor being tied to performing tasks within a certain time period. And there's a big literature on this. I recommend, if you take a look at Brendan Gleeson's work, you can see this quite clearly. How am I doing for time?
We have about 6 minutes.
Okay, it's a good thing I
Thanks
asked.
for asking.
Okay, so with the rise of industrialization, you see strict time requirements on how you complete jobs, and you see this categorization, and Deborah Stone's particularly strong on this. Categorization of who is disabled becomes a central question. And here's where the left, I think, has arguably fallen down in not paying sufficient attention to the disability question, because in many ways it's central to the organizing of capitalism, in that you've got to determine who is going to be on social benefits, who's going to get disability pension, even though the tools being used are completely arbitrary and bogus. And in fact, the literature for that, this is not some postmodernists saying that. This is actually in the very body of the work being cited. So you'll see Deborah Stone, I think at one point, quotes a physician named Kessler, who states, to summarize, it is important to understand the entire pension scheme and disability rating scheme are pure fiction if we feel that the rating table expresses in a scientific way the economic or psychological or physical effects of these injuries, end quote. So the actual physiological categories are very much subject to the state of the economy. Workers' compensation claims are going to fall and rise, and the way they're adjudicated are going to fall and rise depending on a whole set of factors, which shows the false premises of the medical model. In response to that, we've had an array of disability liberation movements that have come up slowly, including the 1977 Hugh sit-ins. And if my other colleagues don't speak about this, we can return to this in question period. I'm running quickly out of time, but 1977 Hugh and the 60s independent living movement marked a turning point. In San Francisco, there was a 25-day sit-in. I talk about this. Others, like the late Paul Longmore, have written much more than I have about this topic. But you can see the sparking of a disability rights movement shifting to modern times. One of the problems, I think, with disability rights movements, I've been critical of the left. In my little time, I will say some critical points about the disability rights movement is co-optation. You have radical activists like ADAPT, but you have the other kind of disability rights movements. I think where there's been co-optation, this is not a common in the United States, this is true for every country. Canada is probably one of the worst places where you have the state co-opting disability rights movements. As soon as the government's paying the bills and limits what you're trying to say, I would call that disability rights movements from above. So you hold a picnic and this kind of thing, as opposed to kind of radical movements. Some people do both. You can have picnics and do, this kind of, I don't know, I'm not so much a picnic person, but this whole, it's particularly important because the most oppressed disabled women, GLBT movements, and racialized disabled people have particularly been left out of mainstream sort of the happy disability rights movements. And I haven't been too sour because I think that I have no doubt that we're going to get radicalism later on in this panel. So I think there's, I'm leaving the angry, I think will come. But I do want to, I'm much more effective speakers than myself. But I do want to leave you, because I think my time is running out, I'm going to leave you with an anecdote from the very, very immediate past, which is the Paralympic Games and the Olympic Games in London, where we saw a great deal of radical militancy. And I think it's sort of the most effective kind of militancy. Why do I say that? Because it tied in with an event with which had enormous media attention already, was already in the public consciousness. And this had to do with the multinational company, the French multinational, Atos, that's sponsoring the Paralympics while getting a contract to test people for benefits, and people found that deeply shameful. Disability activists, that Atos was a sponsor of the Paralympic Games while it was administering fitness to work tests. So they had a £100 million a year contract, which is about, what, $200 million US. That's a lot of money, while they're trying to get all this public attention, and the disability movement got a lot of attention in using the kind of adapt style tactics. And I think you're going to hear more about the militant side of the disability rights movement in a minute. I have many more things I can say, but I think I should probably end it. You'd be happy if I end it.
Yeah.
And I think that's but in question period, if you want to ask me questions about things like the ADA, social transformation, I'm happy to talk to you on whether legislation is a positive tool for social transformation. The answer is maybe on that. So it's kind of, but you need, I think you need one group of people that are doing sort of litigation and are doing the polite sort of disability activism, but that's going to get you nowhere without the angry people doing the struggles from below. And I think that's a nice way to end this.
Speaker is Paula. Oh, you want to go second? Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to, I'm going to talk a little bit about the piece I did for New Politics. I'll hold it up. Oh, can you, a little bit louder? How's this? Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about the piece I did for New Politics. The piece I did was really about a legacy of exploitation. And in my own research and in this piece, what I was looking at is the history around intellectual disability policy and unpaid labor. So just by way of a little bit of an introduction, in my own work and in this piece, I'm drawing on the work of advocates and historians to examine the unpaid labor that takes place in institutions and community settings that support people with intellectual disabilities. Can everyone hear me now? Better? Okay.
A little trouble in the back row.
A little trouble in the back row. So my research in general and this piece are aimed at contributing to the wider body of literature around disability employment. What's kind of happened is there's been quite a bit of literature around disability and employment, but the experience of people with intellectual disabilities is largely ignored in the literature. I think one of the reasons for this is because people with intellectual disabilities have incredibly low rates of employment. So just because people aren't getting paid for their labor, it's kind of easy to ignore that labor. But what I'm trying to do in my own work is to point out that the history of disability services and policies is really a history of exploited labor, especially where people with intellectual disabilities and psychiatric disabilities as well are concerned. So I want to look first at institutions and then at community settings. And what I want to argue is that work is in fact central to this history. And by no means just because I'm starting with institutions, by no means do I want to give the implication that I believe that deinstitutionalization is over and that we've moved past that. I think it's just a good place to start to understand how we've come to understand work and how we've constructed people with intellectual disabilities, the social construction, and to illustrate really this legacy of economic exploitation. It's largely really been invisible, but I think we really need to add to our debates around labor. And I hope that by doing this, I can highlight not only the problematic nature of disability policy, but also I want to start to counter the idea that people with intellectual disabilities don't or can't work, and start to recognize these incredible contributions. So what I want to do is start with the institution. And what I did, because I knew that the audience for New Politics would be an American audience, so a lot of what I'm going to draw on in this talk is based on the work that historians have done and narratives that have emerged from what was called the Rome State School. I think it's here in New York. I think it's upstate New York. Upstate New York, yeah. I believe it closed in 1990.
Yeah, something like that.
So fairly recent, yeah. And just start with an understanding that many of those people who were incarcerated, and just to talk about why I'm choosing the word incarcerated, I'm choosing it really deliberately. Sometimes people are referred to as patients or clients or whatnot. To be institutionalized is to be incarcerated. So I think that's really important to recognize that. But many of those people who were incarcerated, and Ravi kind of touched on it when he talked about industrialization and whatnot. People with disabilities in general were incarcerated because there was this belief that if you weren't working, you would be idle. And of course there's a threat if you're idle. You're going to get into trouble. And there's all these things that happen to really frame disabled people as criminals. And you know, I've seen things about people, you know, warnings that people with disabilities would steal like railway ties and, you know, all these ridiculous things. But it goes behind this idea that if people aren't working for pay, there's a problem. So one of the things to keep in mind is we have all of these people incarcerated under the idea that they're unable or they can't work. But what really starts to emerge is a history of labor. And there's this rhythm to institutional life in which unpaid labor served a lot of functions, but I'm just going to focus because of time on two of the main functions today. The first falls under the umbrella of education and training. So in the 1920s, most institutions actually had vocational and pre-vocational training for kindergarten age inmates, because children were institutionalized as well. This meant that young children were encouraged to integrate tools into their play. This could include learning to hammer nails, punch holes in leather, washing rags on miniature washboards. And there was a what's going to come out, I hope, as I talk, is there was a very gendered nature to this labor. So young men would be tasked with the more physical labor. They might be working in the agricultural programs, which I'll speak a little bit more in a minute, maintenance and whatnot, while female inmates tended to be assigned things like housekeeping, chores, care-related tasks. And some patient narratives which have emerged kind of speak to this. Informally, in the Rome State School specifically, they were referred to as quote-unquote working boys and working girls. And there's a thing around perceived ability here as well, because what the administrators would do is individuals who they consider quote-unquote higher functioning, they would tap into as working boys and working girls, and they would assign them to other inmates who had higher needs to do the care labor. So inmates would assist in feeding. Sometimes inmates were responsible to make sure as many as 3 or 4 other inmates had enough food to eat. A lot of responsibility. They would help with cleanup after meals, bathing other inmates, laundry services, cleaning duties, and supervising other patients. Historians have noted that chores like making beds, mopping, and attendant care were actually referred to with working age inmates as domestic training. So they kind of gave it that name. One thing to keep in mind as I'm talking is these institutions were completely self-contained. So agriculture programs, there would be a farm that would feed, what they produced in the farm would feed everyone in the institution. There were laundry services. In the early institutions, there was no reason to go outside of the actual institution. So they were really self-contained. So it's under the umbrella of education and training, but as you can see, there's really something else going on here. That's what I want to speak to in my second point. How am I doing for time? Good? I'm okay. Okay, good. And the second point is the administrative necessity. So there's obvious cost-saving functions to having, captive inmates do all your labor. And as well, when the institution started to experience a population growth, they found that they could deal with this by having more inmates take on the labor. And what's really interesting to me is when you start to look, and if you want to read more about this, in New Politics and New Politics Online, I don't have time to go through all the historians and whatnot who I've cited, but you can certainly find that online. But one thing to keep in mind is these sites are of course segregated. It's non-competitive work. Participants earn significantly less than the minimum wage. As I said, some individuals could earn like $3 to $5 a week. Pay is classified as a gratuity. Workers are classified as beneficiaries, trainees, or clients rather than employees. And it's really important to keep in mind this terminology because all of this terminology is to avoid labor laws. So that's why in the therapeutic model it looks a little bit different because if they called people workers or employees, and if they called what they gave them pay rather than a gratuity, then labor laws, they would have to comply with them. So that's something to keep in mind. And it's still happening that they're still using this same debate that this is good, this is therapeutic, it gets people engaged. But what really ends up happening is people learn absolutely non-transferable skills. So the things that happen in workshops, sometimes it's things like shredding, collating, sorting, assembling, really monotonous tasks. One of the workshops I looked at in my research, they actually, on their website, talk about, if you want to cut down your labor costs, if you find work monotonous and boring, like come see us. So it's fine for a captive labor pool to do that, but not your workers, right? Some of the stuff that I found is actually really, really highly skilled because one of the arguments against pay is that, well, people aren't really able to do skilled labor, but I don't know, I don't follow baseball, but there's a Canadian company making baseball bats. Barry Bonds was a huge fan of their bats. When he did this big run-up, he was getting all these home runs, he was shattering these records. He was using these baseball bats, and part of the crafting process happened in a sheltered workshop in Canada in their woodworking room. So these bats that Barry Bonds was paying this enormous amount of money for, people were crafting in a woodworking room for no money. And there were all these glowing reviews in the newspaper where it's like, isn't this company great? Isn't it great these people get to be a part of history making these bats? And it's like, these people are being exploited, it's not that great. But for whatever reason, when it comes to people with intellectual disabilities, it's been really hard to get people to recognize that this is labor and it is deserving of a wage. And it's not okay for people to make $2 or $3 a week. If you want to see more about this, the National Disability Rights Network did a recent report that was absolutely brilliant. It talked about how this labor contradicts existing policy and laws like the ADA. It talked about how these sites actually reinforce segregation, how receiving below the minimum wage just reinforces poverty, and how there's an emphasis on non-transferable skills. So any argument that this is to prepare people for open labor just falls short completely. And what we have is we have now sheltered workshops that are operating these agencies as a human service and as a business. And they're allowed to kind of skirt the line. Because they're nonprofits, they get away with a lot that businesses wouldn't. They have this labor pool that they don't have to pay wages to, so it's really dangerous territory. And they do serve a business function. I mean, the disability industry, and you can read more about that, it makes a lot of money. And there's a lot of incentive for these sheltered workshops to remain. They employ a lot of non-disabled individuals. And we know from the research as well that much like what we saw in the institutions, a lot of sheltered workshops will keep, quote unquote, keep their best employees. So rather than helping to facilitate competitive employment, which is what they should be doing, they're hesitant to let people go because these are their best employees. These are the people they need to keep bringing in corporate clients. Oh, 1 minute. In conclusion, I'll just jump to it. I was going to go into some other stuff, but maybe that'll come up in question period. But I think what's really important in this economic climate is that there are some clear incentives for businesses to maintain this kind of exploitation. And even though we have evidence to suggest that this isn't good, this is happening, and some businesses who probably otherwise wouldn't survive are thriving because of this captive labor pool. So I think this speaks to the need for the experience of workers with intellectual disabilities to be integrated into disability employment debates, but also into mainstream equity and labor movements, because I think people with intellectual disabilities are largely going to support.
Thank you. Every time you think you know how bad capitalism is, you need to learn something more. There are a few sign-up lists going around.
Betty Reed Mandel has an article called Means Testing, Shredding the Safety Net. I wrote an article with a similar title called Welfare Reform, Shredding the Safety Net, which appeared in Able News shortly after July 26, 1996, when under the guise of national welfare reform, immigrant workers who were ill or disabled or became ill or disabled after working here at some of the poorest paid jobs with some of the worst working conditions after trying to support themselves and their families could no longer qualify for income support or health insurance, even if they met the incredibly restrictive income requirements because the federal government changed or shredded the system because of the quote-unquote welfare reforms that happened July 26th, that infamous day. If you work in social service, that day is infamous because that was the quote-unquote day that immigrant workers could no longer qualify for benefits. But the federal government did nothing to change it. And unfortunately, the American Association for Retired Persons did not speak up against it either. A lot of advocacy organizations, or alleged advocacy organizations, were notably silent. As a civil and disability rights activist and social worker, I found this like an incredible disgrace. In the disability rights movement for the past 40 years, we've had our stars, but the disability rights movement didn't start in a vacuum. It started as the result of other civil rights struggles that we've learned from. We witnessed the civil rights struggles of Black people in the South and their efforts to integrate schools, to have access to public facilities like restaurants, to get to sit anywhere they chose on public transit buses. In fact, the disability rights movement fought for many of the same things: the right to have public facilities, the right to have access to education, the right to use public transit. Some of the exact things we fought for and won were the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that banned discrimination against people with disabilities in places that receive federal funds. And in terms of getting that passed, there were some major sit-ins, about 28 days in California. Then we fought to get that expanded because we didn't want our rights to depend upon receiving federal funds. So one of our next big laws was the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. And the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act was a huge victory, and many people think of it as the kind of declaration of independence for persons with disabilities. But actually, personally, I don't think this is the case. It's a very important civil rights law, and its aim is to end or at least reduce discrimination faced by people with disabilities and those perceived as having a disability or those with the record of an impairment. But the ADA falls extremely short of its intended goal. Why? I mean, for one thing, it's a law without teeth. It's only enforced if those who feel their rights have been violated under the law choose to sue. It's also an unfunded mandate. Also, since the ADA has been passed, there have been many attempts to revise it. In addition, our rights under the Americans with Disabilities are still dependent upon cost. I mean, for example, if I as a wheelchair user want to enter an older building, whether that building has to make their entrance accessible depends upon the cost. And whether the building, even so, whether the building chooses to request a waiver due to hardship. So our rights to access to accommodation are not granted as full civil human rights, even with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Our rights are still dependent upon cost and goodwill. That, as far as I'm concerned, is not full equality. We've learned from the struggles of the women's movement and by the struggles of the gay, lesbian, and transgendered people and their struggles. And we share many of the same issues that they're fighting for and that we're still fighting for. The right to work, the right to marry. For example, in order to qualify for government health programs, many people with disabilities have to remain single, unable to marry our life partners, because if they choose to marry, they'll lose their financial right to qualify for the government benefits that they depend upon for health care. We're still struggling for the right to housing, for equality in health care, for access to education, and for an end to discrimination. I've been involved in the disability rights struggle for about 35 years, and I presently serve as president of Disabled in Action, a civil rights group for persons with disabilities and others who share our goals. DIA started about 40 years ago by Judy Heumann. Ms. Heumann was a wheelchair user who had completed teacher training, and she wanted to get a license to teach in the New York City schools. Although she'd completed all the requirements for teacher training at that time, but at that time, a person with a disability had to go for a special competency test to get a teaching license. Basically, what you had to do was the Board of Examiners would, if you weren't already teaching, but you couldn't teach in the New York City schools, the Board of Examiners would place you in a school and ask you to do whatever was difficult because of your disability. For example, I had to go through that as well when I sought to get a teaching license. In my case, I was already teaching in a private school in New Jersey. They came to see me at my job. At that point, I was legally blind, as I've always been, and I was not in the wheelchair at that time. And they asked me to do what was difficult for me to do as a visually impaired person. See across a room, ask me what was on the walls, which I'd memorized because I'd asked another teacher. Of course I couldn't see it, but I knew they were going to ask me that. I asked them to tell me what was on the walls of the largest room in the school. And, you know, they asked me to lead the group, lead the whole school around lead an assembly in the largest room in the school. And then when they saw me with my students, they handed me a newspaper and asked me to read it. I read them the headlines and handed it back to them. Then they asked me to show them my record keeping. I pointed to the large print charts that I had all over the walls for charting, because I was a special ed teacher and we kept what we called behavioral record keeping at that time. I pointed to my large print charts all over the walls, and they watched me with my students. I got the license, and that was back in 1984, and I'm happy to say I was the last person to ever have to take that off a competency test. Now, things have changed since then. There have certainly been changes in the last 35 years. New construction is usually required to be accessible. We now have lifts on the New York City buses. We got that because of a lawsuit, and then once we had the lifts on the buses, we had to fight to actually get them to operate them. Many of us threw ourselves on the bus lifts. I did that many, many more times than I would like to count. We have a limited number of subway stations that are wheelchair accessible as part of that same lawsuit. And yes, I know the gaps are still a problem. We are soon supposed to have long distance lift-equipped buses. Those are like the Trailways and Greyhound buses, kind of buses that I'm talking about. We often see wheelchair seating at public events, and I don't just mean ours, where we go to leave spaces. And listening to assistive listening devices in a lot of places. Have we seen an end to employment discrimination with an unemployment rate of approximately 70%? Of course not. Do we have equality of access to education or health care? No. Do we have to fight to maintain the gains we've made and to work for others? Of course we do. Occupy now gives us, in the disability community, a unique opportunity to join coalitions for fighting for social justice. We've been able to help them see that as victims of oppression and poverty, we're part of the 99%. Thank you.
Is anybody else harboring one of these? Thanks very much. Well, these talks are really
speak about the relationship of the disability rights movement in the U.S. to other movements fighting for social justice and to Occupy Wall Street. Shortly after the occupation of Zuccotti Park, I started organizing disabled people to join in the new Occupy Wall Street movement, which seemed to be growing. I was criticized by leaders in the disability rights movement, including my good friend Bob Kafka, who is recognized as a national leader of ADAPT. ADAPT, for those who haven't heard of it, is a grassroots organization of people with all types of disabilities, though the majority have physical disabilities. Founded in 1982, ADAPT fought first for access to public transportation, and at the time, ADAPT stood for American Disabled for Accessible Public Transit. Then, after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the focus shifted to freeing people from institutions and make it possible for people with even the most significant disabilities to live in their own homes, in the community, with all the necessary services and supports. Then ADAPT came to stand for American Disabled for Attendant Programs Today. I want to clarify that these services and supports are provided or would be provided by Medicaid. It's the only way. And I'm sure you all know that Medicaid is the healthcare program for the poor. So ADAPT is fighting not for the Larry Flynn's and Christopher Reeves, but for the neediest and the poorest. And by the way, ADAPT now doesn't stand for anything. It's no longer an acronym. ADAPT makes very effective use of civil disobedience. At national ADAPT actions, 100 to 200 people, most if not all disabled, get arrested. Getting arrested is proof of our commitment and is an empowering act for those who have been powerless. ADAPT activists are very proud when they get arrested, though it's always an ordeal, especially for those with significant disabilities. I've been arrested with ADAPT more times than I can remember. I lost count, honestly, years ago. Now, since ADAPT is known as the radical arm of the disability rights movement, you wouldn't think an ADAPT leader would disapprove of our involvement in Occupy, would you? Yet Bob wrote to me, at a time when our people across the country are being threatened with cuts to basic services, states are slashing Medicaid budgets, workers with disabilities are being targeted and laid off, sheltered employment pays sub-minimum wages, we need to use our scarce organizing energies and resources carefully and not be dazzled by a movement that hardly recognizes our issues. And he added, personally, I'm tired of educating progressives on our issues 38 years after 504 and 21 years after the ADA. Bob's message exemplifies an attitude that's widespread in the disability rights movement, that of seeing our issues as ours and ours alone. Now, I don't need to convince you that it's always the poorest and the neediest that pay for the sins of the rich. In times of plenty, the poor are thrown some crumbs, and those crumbs often are enough to pacify us and render us passive. In times of economic crisis, of course, the poor are the ones who are made to bear the heaviest burden. Because even in times of economic boom, we have always had the highest unemployment rates. And because so many of our people have always depended on social programs, there is no question that the disability community was hit as hard as could be during the latest economic crisis caused by Wall Street and the big banks, and caused by our government's faith in the free market and the conviction that an unregulated market is the best way to increase economic growth, that no matter how much social damage it may cause, it will ultimately benefit everyone. That conviction was unshaken by the economic crisis. In fact, what was the remedy? The big banks got bailed out.
Yep.
Banks got bailed out, we got sold out. Though the disability community was hit very hard, others suffered too. Disabled and non-disabled alike were hurt by those Medicaid cuts. And by unemployment and cuts to public school budgets and senior programs and homeless assistance to all social programs, which is what always happens in a time of economic crisis. So why was Bob telling me to focus on our issues? Why was he accusing me of spreading myself thin when all I was doing was joining forces in order to be stronger? Of course, I didn't follow Bob's advice and went on to start the Disability Caucus of Occupy Wall Street. Just as on the West Coast, in Chicago, and in other cities, other disabled people were organizing and joining the Occupy movement. But I brought this up because I want to look a little bit closer at the relationship of the disability rights movement with other movements fighting for social justice, and in general, with the left. Actually, being born and raised in Italy, I never thought there was much of a left in the United States. But, you know. The disability rights movement, as Paula told us, was born out of other movements in a time of great uprising, a time very similar to our own. We have always followed the example of other movements, certainly the civil rights movement. For 40 years, over 40 years, we have demanded our civil rights. From the very start, we called ourselves a minority. In fact, in the US, the minority model is probably more recognized and better understood than the social model. Disabled in Action from the beginning had strong connections with other progressive movements and leftist groups. I remember through the years us bringing the BIA banner, I'm sure you do too, Paula, at every anti-war rally, women's rights, anti-nuke, environmental, every gay pride march. That was fun.
We carried it enough of them.
When, in 1977, as Paula mentioned, the San Francisco disability rights activists set in for 28 days in the health, education, and welfare offices in order to get the regulations to Section 504 of the Rehab Act signed. They had the full support of the very progressive East Bay community. The Black Panthers brought them food. The Butterfly Brigade, a gay group, provided them with walkie-talkies. We didn't have, we couldn't text them. The sit-in started what at the time we thought what would be a tradition of solidarity between disability rights and other movements also fighting for social justice. Yet, through the years, while individual disability rights activists have often been active in various other groups fighting oppression, on the whole, the disability rights movement in the US has insulated itself from other movements. Those national organizations that supposedly represent us have, in general, put their trust on the liberal Democrats as being better than the Republicans. Why has this happened? If you ask around, what you'll hear is about the other social movements. They don't want us. They don't want us. And indeed, I can't talk. I gotta drink some. I'm trying to speak as fast as I can, so I don't go over the 15 minutes.
You can have 16 minutes.
Okay. There. Oh, that's a big help. Indeed, leftist groups are notorious for holding events and meetings without giving any thought to access, whether it's wheelchair accessibility, materials in alternate format, sign language interpreters. What you may also hear is they don't get it. And I'm going to tell you a little story that's a bit disturbing here. In October of 1986, ADAPT was fighting for wheelchair lifts on buses and was in Detroit to hassle the American Public Transit Association, which was holding a convention there. Now, since Rosa Parks lived in Detroit, ADAPT invited Rosa Parks to attend their press conference and lead their march. In the fight to get on the bus, ADAPT activists had been using Rosa Parks as their icon, often appearing at protests with name tags reading, "My name is Rosa Parks," trying to make the public connect our protest with the civil rights movement. An often quoted soundbite from ADAPT in those years was, "A civil rights movement was born when people refused to ride at the back of the bus. We can't even get on the bus." Well, Rosa Parks failed to appear at the ADAPT press conference in March. Instead, ADAPT got a letter from her. Rosa Parks cited as her reason for refusing the invitation the traumatic manner in which you, speaking to ADAPT, choose to dramatize disabled Americans' lack of access to public transit. She said she didn't want to embarrass the city's visitors and cripple the city's present transportation system. It was a big blow, and I don't want to elaborate. But we realized, and this will be confirmed in the future, that while we try to show the similarity of our movement to other social justice movements, those other social movements were not so interested in our commonalities. Even when our issues were the same as their issues, they preferred to see them as special. And they saw us disabled activists as special and inspirational. They kindly offered support, but not true solidarity, which only comes when you can identify with each other. The most respected community organizers and activists treated us the same as everyone else did. The wall of ableism stood between us. Ableism is the belief that an able body is the norm in this society and that people who have disabilities must strive to get as close as they can to that norm, which we cannot always do, nor do we necessarily want to do. And that disability is inherently a bad thing, a tragedy, rather than a simple consequence of being human. Ableism is prejudice, and we encounter it every day, and we fight against it every day. I hope all this explains where Bob Kafka, the ADAPT leader, and many, many of us are coming from. I must say, though, that in times of economic crisis, usually we manage to join forces with others fighting oppression. Certainly, Disabled in Action has always done that. I remember us joining the Same Boat Coalition, I think it was in the early 90s, Paula?
Yes.
In 1993, when we organized the Disability Independence Day March, an event that drew close to 3,000 people, we managed to bring together not only all the different segments of our community, people with all different types of disabilities, but we had marching with us many activists representing different social justice groups. We had labor. But I guess I better get to Occupy before you tell me I only have 2 minutes left. When we started going down to Zuccotti Park, while we got the same pat on the head we're used to getting, and how inspirational you are for coming here, and it must have been so hard for you to come here because of your condition, etc., from the people congregating around the park, whether they were organizers, leftists, or simply curious visitors, we were welcomed by the occupiers of Zuccotti Park. They may not have immediately been aware of our various needs for access, but we felt, and I'll use an even stronger word than welcome, we felt embraced. What we soon realized was that many of the people in Zuccotti Park had experienced real oppression, and also that many of them were disabled. Some whose disabilities were hidden chose to come out, reveal their disabilities to us, ask for advice in dealing with a hostile system. So though I never spent a night at Zuccotti Park, I felt at home there. Then on November 15, the park was raided. What had been lovingly built was destroyed. The people were driven away, pepper sprayed, beaten, arrested. 2 days after that, I was arrested in the attempt by Occupy Wall Street to block the stock exchange. Right after that, Disabled in Action and Crips Occupy Wall Street, another group, who had been going to Zuccotti Park regularly, decided we should formalize our presence in the Occupy movement, and so we became the Disability Caucus of Occupy Wall Street. We have taken part in many OWS events and actions, and have had our own events and action with Occupy there with us. In fact, on August 8th, we protested in front of Gracie Mansion and had 8 arrests.
Well, Robbie mentioned picnics. And that was a picnic.
That was supposed to be right. We made believe that it was going to be a big thing.
Well, the governor was having a picnic.
No, it's Bloomberg.
It's Bloomberg. The mayor was having we didn't want to attend his picnic.
Okay, the reason I didn't want to say too much because I'm afraid of running
Sorry, I don't want to distract you.
out of time. But yes, the reason we did that was because our dear Mayor Bloomberg was throwing a party to honor the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Oh.
And we knew very well that he could care less for the Americans with Disabilities Act, and not only, but he had fought us in court when we demanded wheelchair accessible cabs. He fought us in court and won, you know, was there, you know, very happy to have won, and you know, we felt that he was, by inviting us to Gracie Mansion for this picnic, he was trying to buy us off with a pat on the head, a hamburger and a pat on the head, as we put it. Just like, well, I mean, he's bought everything else, including the third term, etc. But I don't want to get into any of that. We had another forum, by the way, there are two people here who were arrested on the 8th, and Carr here and I, we had another forum arrest on September 17 when we blocked Broadway at Liberty, right in front of Security Park. We have earned the respect of the Occupy movement in New York City. Of course, a lot has changed since the days of the Security Park occupation. The media reports that the movement has dwindled, and in a way that's true, since Occupy Wall Street, as we knew it, has a lot fewer people today. What we have today is a loose conglomeration of different groups working on different issues, all using the language and ideology of Occupy. Some groups were in existence long before Occupy. Some are old left, others are new. I know there are protests every single day, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. And I've seen the same faces at times at different protests. This tells me the Occupy movement has evolved. What it has done is bring various groups fighting for social justice together. And I'm proud to say that we are there too, and our presence is felt. And by the way, that's something that I feel would not have happened if Occupy had allowed itself to be pressured into choosing one or two very clear paths. I'm almost done. What Occupy has done is embolden all of us. You will hear words said out loud that you didn't hear before, words like revolution. You'll hear people saying, I'm a socialist, a democratic socialist, whatever kind of socialist, or even an anarchist. This is the time for the disability movement to be bold. What's been happening for years is they throw us those crumbs and they threaten the program for the poor. Medicaid is inherently discriminatory. It is medical apartheid. Why is it that the disability movement has not joined the movement for a national health care program? A strong national health care program that includes long-term care, so that people don't have to impoverish themselves and forced to stay poor and be afraid to get married in order to get services that should be ours by right. That's just one example. I could give you many, but the time is up. We need to move beyond ramps. That's the title of a book my friend Martha Russell wrote back in '97. We even need to move beyond fighting for equality and fight to change the system that creates and fosters inequality. My ADAPT t-shirt here says, free our people. I know that our people will not truly be free unless we all join together and fight for all oppressed people to be free. Thank you.
Upcoming events around Greece, which are, in a way, part of what we say is we're all Greeks, and that ties in very much with what Nadina had said. So we'll get into a discussion period, and please don't feel like you have to only ask a question. You can feel comfortable making a comment. You know, we'll give you, I feel like I'm this terrible timekeeper, but you know, a couple of minutes, you can talk. Or
the gym after last night.
I mean, for the lawyers to answer this. Can a civil rights law ever be called an unfunded mandate? Lawyers, say something. Yeah, I think
Can I
that
try
is
this
a
a
question.
second? Frank Wyman.
Yeah.
Doris and I know each other. I'm Vice President of the Society for Disability Studies and a recovering attorney. This has been an argument forever. The notion of an unfunded mandate
Speak up
goes,
so people
the concept of an unfunded mandate goes way back to William Graham Sumner in the 1880s. He was a sociologist at Yale, I'm ashamed to say, because that's where I got my BA. But he said you can't create a program where a couple of people in government decide that there should be benefits for someone else that a third group of people pay for against their will. Okay? He had a piece on that called The Forgotten Man. Today be the forgotten woman as well if you were a conservative feminist, and there is such a thing. But the problem, well, yeah, but you know, that's the argument, that you can't have a program that says you have to change things and spend money if you don't get funded. Okay? That's contrasted to perhaps the civil rights movement, where presumably it didn't cost the University of Mississippi any money to admit James Meredith, unless it was perhaps additional campus security to make sure he wasn't murdered. But that's only my take on it.
So you're saying you can't?
Well, I mean, somebody can make that argument. Okay, I don't buy it. Okay, because I think that if you're operating in a free society and getting the benefits of it, you should be doing what's right for everybody. First of all, because it's right, and also ultimately because it's going to be good for you as a business, which some people are sufficiently, forgive me, dense not to understand.
Better to have educated people who can...
Could I?
Yeah, okay.
Just another
Say who
take
you
on
are. Say
it.
who you are.
Oh, I'm Heidi Siegfried. I'm the Health Policy Director at Center for Independence of the Disabled. And another take on it would be just this whole cost-benefit analysis, because really, I mean, that's the whole problem with the ADA. It's not a mandate. They've taken this sort of cost-benefit analysis to it. And this month's Nation of the, or this last week's Nation actually has this whole thing about the 1% court and how the court has been moving towards doing more cost-benefit, you know, towards the side of the corporations and doing more cost-benefit analysis and looking at the costs rather than, I mean, a lot of these laws are passed because of some kind of, you know, Congress actually had some other ideas in mind about, you know, moral fairness and things like that, and not a cost-benefit analysis. And the court has just been, you know, ramming cost-benefit analysis down our throats. But that's what the ADA does, essentially. It's not really right.
Well, on that, but also, my name is Joe Fine. I'm not quite recovered labor lawyer, but I'm displaced by my disability, and I'm working to become a workplace disability activist. And as I'm beginning to learn about the ADA, and I'm not presumptuous enough, although fairly presumptuous, to try to tell you all about the ADA, but I do see it as a partially compelling statute, telling employers that even if it costs them something, they may have to accommodate. And the fight is over what's reasonable and how much they can be forced to do. And given the 20-odd imperfect years of the ADA, I'd like to ask everyone here what they think the biggest obstacles are to people who have disabilities, and in particular, who were active in the workplace before those disabilities took hold. What the biggest obstacles to their regaining or retaining employment.
Maybe we'll give you guys a chance to say something about whatever's...
I'll give it a shot.
I mean, I've always been disabled, so I can't talk to you about before I was disabled. I've always been disabled. I am employed, but I mean, I can talk about barriers, but I can't talk to you about barriers as a non-disabled person becoming disabled. That I can't.
Well, I don't mean to overly narrow it. That's what I've been confronted. So.
I think the predominant barrier is discrimination. people see the disability. It doesn't matter what qualifications you go in with. Because the thing is, look, I mean, when you go for a job, there are many applicants besides you. And yes, the ADA says the employer is supposed to accommodate. But look, you're not the only applicant. And even if you're qualified, chances are there are other applicants who are going to go who are also qualified. But, so, you go in the door, and especially if you have a very obvious disability. In most workplaces, now I work at a specialized sort of place. I'm working at an independent living center. That's different. At an independent living center, the majority of the employees are people with disabilities. The organization is run by people with disabilities. The majority of the board are people with disabilities. Unusual work environment. But if I go to a more standard work environment where I've worked in the past, it's not the same thing. You know, you go to they have to see beyond that disability. And for them to do that, it's very difficult. They have to see something in your qualifications that puts you above every other person that they're looking at. And that's very difficult. And even if they see that, they have to still see past your disabilities. So you better really, really, really impress them. And then what you need for accommodations better not be much. And they can't even ask you what you need before they give you an employment offer. So there's an awful lot in there. So, you know, that's really a lot. And then to prove they didn't hire you because of your disability, when chances are they had 15 other applicants who were qualified. That's a lot. So.
I just want to say that my sister, Rita, who looked for jobs before there was an ADA or Section 504, she would go for a job, PhD in mathematics, very qualified to do lots of things. And she was told that they're not going to hire her because she's disabled. What happened? What's the change? Big change in that now they have to say they're not going to hire her because they found someone more qualified.
Other panelists?
Depending on how significant the disability is, another barrier may be that you're not going to be able to get health insurance, and therefore, if you may decide that it's best to apply for disability and get Medicare. If your disability is such, for example, Danny, who's my life partner, he's sitting right there. When he became disabled, he was working in the film industry as a set decorator. When he started needing help getting in and out of bed, when he started needing long-term care, the only way to get long-term care in the United States is through Medicaid. And therefore, if you, well, first of all, I was saying before, if you apply for disability, while in summer, and I like to have a conversation with the people who come from Canada, because, you know, I don't know how things are in Canada. In the U.S., disability is defined as, by Social Security, as inability to work. So in order to get benefits, you have to show that you cannot work. I know in Italy, I'm Italian, so I know how things are in Italy. You can get your disability benefit and continue to work. It doesn't interfere, but it does in the United States. If you need long-term care and you have to impoverish yourself and get on Medicaid, because that's the only way. I mean, in the United States, if you need long-term care, unless you, when you were young enough and bought private long-term care insurance,
And even so, if you become disabled and you're gonna be living hopefully a long life and needing a lot of assistance, even if you did buy that long-term care, private long-term care insurance, it's not going to take you very far because usually there's a limit of 3 or 4 years. If Danny had it when he became disabled, he became disabled in 1988, it would not have lasted him long. So when 17,
I worked for many years, and of course you try to save some money. But this time of my life, if I need any assistance, I have to pay for it.
And I know you didn't mean to say this, but I don't think they were so golden, because I think many of these things that we're talking about, although not quite as vicious as today when we're in the period of neoliberal cutbacks and globally, you know, they just have knives and forks out for us. Nonetheless, those days in the 60s and 70s were terrible, and they're worse in this country than in Europe because we've had a weaker labor movement, a weaker socialist movement. But I wonder whether, for those of you who are not from the United States, you know, how good was it in the, quote, golden years?
Okay, well, there were so many minutes of that question. There were some other.
It's a free
so many
questions. It's kind of over. I want to go back. Just I'll answer that in a second to, and I don't remember names. I'm sorry, the gentleman. I think it's fine. So the question there, I'm asked that question constantly, just because of the nature of what I do. I've lived in the United States briefly, but I'm not an expert on the vast American system, particularly Medicare is totally beyond my area of expertise. But in the Canadian context, I could answer that question, and I get that answer a lot. It's quite biased, and I really like Paula's answer, which was discrimination, because it gives you this kind of global kind of approach to just get into it. And the disability movement is not of one voice on many issues. I don't even see it as one movement. But I still, nevertheless, with all those caveats, I would answer transportation, because, and I think this ties into something that I think would be of interest to the American audience, because in many ways, although both countries fail miserably in a sort of social justice perspective, the areas of where the ADA has seen the most success, I would argue, are in things like amenities, and you'd see this less so, I think, in places like New York City, something like Vegas or California, where, you know, Canadians are shocked to go to places where services are physically accessible for wheelchair users everywhere. Things like transportation, it was, I think, 2011 or 2012 that where I live, which is the national capital, got wheelchair lifts everywhere. So I think in that sense, it's a big failure. We have to learn from American transportation experts. We have to learn from physical access people when we're getting our legislation, the AODA in Ontario that's just starting out. We need to learn from you on those. There's no question about that. The flip side, though, is I think, and Jihan might disagree with me, I think if you've already had a job in Canada, which is a big if in the disability community, I think job retention is better in the United States, simply because the degeneration of, I'm a union member, for example, and a professor, which is virtually all Canadian professors are union members, including adjuncts, by the way. So I mean, that's just a different story. Many Americans are not even allowed to unionize as a professor because of NLRA rulings that are very strange. You know, the NLRB has ruled in many other ways. For Joanne Landy's question on the 30 glorious years, certainly for disabled people in all OECD countries, those were years of lesser access for women. Those were years where patriarchy was more prominent. My point is not to diminish the social movements, but it's simply that in some senses you had a certain vibrancy that for the economy that we've now lost. And I think it's important to remember, because people that are younger than me, including my age, just don't remember those years in the 60s and the 50s where, you know, I mean, you know, I could tell stories, I don't think it's relevant. You know, people, 1948, they graduated and they decided, I knew a Harvard alum, and he decided to, he was a Harvard alum, but he went on a ship, I forget, it's a stevedore, and his partner didn't leave him, which is not, and he decided that this would be his career, and he spent years on a stevedore. When he wanted to come back, he could get an exact job in his field. Now, he's able-bodied, but I think that those days are over. Everyone is tailoring their market their qualifications to the market, the kind of thing where you could just go be a stevedore for 5 years and just come back. That is something that was iconic for those years. Were they accessible? No. Were they sexist? Yes. I mean, there was a homophobic, sexist time, but I think there's something for those years that it's difficult for younger people to even grasp the whole notion. When I think I've seen US statistics on average job rate. Years people have held a job in the United States, and it's low. It's much lower than other countries. My father held the same job for 40 years, and he's in his 80s. That's not that uncommon. He had a government job, he was an engineer, 40 years he held the job. I think it's 3.5 years is the average length that an American has held a job, because job turnover is so frequent, and that has implications for accommodations. And that's the last point I'm going to shut up. The other point is, I think that the big failure of the ADA, and I've researched this, is Title I. And some people are defensive about this, others are not. And there's long, complicated reasons for this. Some of it is some of the things people have said. I think it's more complicated. I think the story is complex. It has to do with definitions of disability. But Title I, having to do with employment, has not been a success story, and that's the weakest part of the ADA. Why? We'd have to have another panel for that.
Well, I can't really elaborate on that anymore. In terms of your question about the glory years, if I'm looking specifically at my research and people with intellectual disabilities, in Ontario, they officially closed all the institutions in 2009. And what we've seen happen in the community, it's not much more encouraging. We have institutions on smaller scales. So in terms of the experience of people with intellectual disabilities, there's still a long way to go. Things are not.
Exploited immigrants, sweatshop, they speak exploit child labor, etc., etc. So I was it didn't even cross my mind, but I'm glad that I was educated that that also includes disabled people. And I kind of and what you're saying, that it's they don't like to call it work. They don't call workers or employees, or they don't call it what they make as wages, because I forgot what you said. They call everything because they don't want it to be protected by laborers, and I would imagine also they don't want it to unionize. But I kind of missed out on what you said that it was like. What kind of a program it is?
Sheltered workshops?
Yeah, it's shelter workshops. Yeah, because I wanted to report into it, because that sounds interesting. It never even crossed my mind that another source of, in addition to all the sources of cheap labor, another source is disabled people. Shelter workshops.
Yeah, and sometimes they'll call it like employment or pre-employment programming. They'll kind of dress it up to make it sound a little bit different, but that's what's happening.
Just one little comment. We had a sheltered workshop up in Oswego County in New York State where they had the red hats and the blue hats or something. In other words, like you said, the people were doing the same work and they really felt they had to identify who was somebody with a disability and who wasn't. And, because a friend of mine's son worked there, and he worked there as a blue hat, and he was somebody who graduated from college and was fully able to.